The sun rose over Pearl Harbor, casting long shadows across the crowded yards as American officers gathered their nerves, clutching maps and files. A sudden explosion shattered the calm, sending shards of metal and chaos into the air. Many scrambled, panicked, while others found themselves staring at the change in the sky. From the balcony of a nearby building, a young woman recognized the unfamiliar silhouette of a gunshot. She remembered the training she had just learned. The sound was followed by the unmistakable roar of waves slamming into the nearby hangars. Soldiers from both sides rushed forward, some in uniforms marked with insignia, others dressed in battle gear regardless of language. A moment of confusion passed through the air before the first drone circled above, scanning the destroyed space. In that instant, the harbor became a battlefield, and the world's fate hung in the balance. As the din of artillery faded, the voices rose. Urgency, fear, and confusion. Soldiers from the Japanese side shouted orders, their faces pale beneath the strain of the sudden clash. Those from the United States demonstrated tension and resolve, some rallying under the determined gaze of flags and banners frozen in time. The air crackled with tension, a silent fuse prepared to ignite. Inside the damaged chaos, a commander frantically attempted to communicate with his officers, trying to halt the unfolding disaster. The turning point came as radio transmissions crackled across distant frequencies, signaling the beginning of the United States response. Amid the fire and confusion, a figure in a commando suit caught sight of the approaching aircraft, and knowing instantly, he faced a choice: retreat or fight. The decision would shape the course of a nation's history. From that moment, the tide of war shifted. The Japanese forces, overwhelmed by the resistance and the specter of further destruction, found themselves pushed back. Crudely hit by the roar of engines and the thunder of tanks, they scrambled to regroup. Amidst the wreckage, escaped soldiers carried stories of courage and defiance, while exhausted officers deliberated whether to surrender or continue the fight. The Japanese high command, torn between desperation and hope, sent messages of surrender through strained radio waves. But even as negotiations stumbled, something longer lingered. A determination to resist, to endure, no matter the cost. The air still hummed with tension as the first stages of the Pacific Campaign unfolded. Leadership faced the hard truth. Failure within the harbor meant loss worldwide. The battle raged on into the morning, soldiers moving with desperation, officers barking orders amid the ruins. The clash between Japan's forces and the inexorable advance of the Allies reshaped the future of a young nation. A new chapter was unfolding, one marked by courage, sacrifice, and the weight of global consequence. Behind the smoke and fire, the world held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Equal sign, 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 equal sign. The battlefield at Pearl Harbor might be shrouded in smoke and ruin, but the echoes of this day would never fade. The room buzzed with silence after the last retreating soldier vanished through the smoke, leaving behind a scene of bitter defeat. From a sunlit courtyard in a military headquarters across the bay, the scene unfolded. A corridor of demand, signals flickering on a desk, the soft hum of radios carrying urgent messages. Colonel James McAllister, a seasoned operative embedded within Army intelligence, lifted the phone with cautious precision. His eyes scanned the data streaming in, following the notes of a different strategic decision. Across the room, a senior officer drafted a final report, the weight of history pressing down on every decision. The colossal presence of Admiral Yamamoto stood nearby, his expression unreadable as he kept silence, the weight of his nation's future resting on his shoulders. In the chaos, a mysterious messenger flashed on the walls. A red scrawl said, "Action," in bold, blood-red ink. The room fell silent, all thoughts sharpening on the urgency of the moment. Canceling this mission meant guaranteeing war across the Pacific, yet the cost of hesitation loomed larger. Word soon spread through the ranks, pulling leaders into a tense chamber where strategies were laid bare. Prayers were offered for tomorrow, but many knew the stakes were permanent. As night settled over the city, spiraling decisions were made, each one carrying the memories of a nation trembling in the balance. The alarm sounded, and a corridor of voices erupted, defying fate with the fury of its resistance. Equal sign, 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 equal sign. By dawn, the Japanese had withdrawn, leaving behind a war-torn harbor and a shattered city. The United States moved forward, determined, with the resolve of a generation pinned to its destiny. Maps pulled from memory revealed the lines they had crossed, the lives they had lost, and the dangerous paths they had crossed. In Washington, the scene was different. coffee cups steaming, empty banquet tables, and indifferent faces staring at maps spread across polished wooden surfaces. A young officer stood at the edge of the conference room, watching headlines scroll past a large screen while his thoughts drifted to a relative in a distant relative station. The words on the screen emphasized a return to normalcy. Predictable, comforting, but for those who had witnessed the fall of Pearl Harbor, it was anything but safe. The room buzzed with cautious conversations, the atmosphere heavy with the gravity of the events that had transpired only hours before. Some leaned forward, eager to hear more about the strategies and decisions that had unfolded. A senior advisor present noted the potential ramifications on global politics, anticipating shifts in alliances and military approaches. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of reflection and determination etched on everyone's faces. Outside, the sun rose on a battlefield where war had just begun again, the world holding its breath and searching for answers in a nation forever changed. Equal sign, 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 equal sign. From the ashes of Japan's once mighty forces, a new understanding began to take shape. The moments of that morning were etched in the minds of generals, strategizing, soldiers debating routes, and civilians mourning what was lost. They discussed the need for caution, for patience, for a strategy that would ultimately refute the idea of imperial ambition. Some leaders feared another catastrophe. This time, American hands would shape the outcome. As debates raged, an air of uncertainty hung thick over the world. The events that had unfolded had ignited a fire within every player, a drive to prevent history from repeating itself. In that aftermath, the importance of unity, leadership, and foresight became clear. The leaders that emerged from the crisis understood that war, their reality, was only beginning, and the stakes were higher than ever. This was no mere moment. It was a turning point that would shape the future on a global scale. Equal sign, 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 equal sign. The long hours that followed were a tense process of evaluation and planning. Reports detailing the movements of Japanese troops, the resilience of American defenders, and the lessons from the battlefield informed the next steps. Officers pored over photos and maps, identifying the gaps in knowing about those in occupied territories, the condition of infrastructure, and the morale of military personnel. They met with analysts who studied the footage from every available source, from archival photo essays to classified documents, seeking patterns and insights. Behind closed doors, officers debated the merits of mercy versus retribution, weighing the implications of their decisions on civilian lives and future conflicts. Night after night, the silence of the days brought clarity. Soon, the fog would lift, revealing the next phase of the war. The anticipation grew, not just for victory, but for the survival of the ideals these leaders had sworn to protect. Now, as the city began its quiet reconstruction, the memories of Pearl Harbor knew they would never be completely forgotten. The sun struggled to rise over Honolulu, its pale rays grazing the shattered decks of the aircraft carriers that had once stood proud in the harbor. The day after the attack, sailors emerged from the wreckage, their faces soot-stained and eyes hollow with disbelief. In the chaos of the airfields, the smell of burnt rubber and oil mingled with the acrid sting of gunpowder, a scent that would remain etched in their memories for decades. A lone B-17 bomber, its wings splintered, hovered low over the harbor, a silent testament to the unfinished business of a war that had only just begun. In the Navy's damaged aircraft, the tattered flag of the United States Congress rattled in the wind, fluttering beside the tattered Japanese ensign that lay buried beneath the metal hull. A whisper of a miscommunication spread through the ranks. The captains of the fleet had lacked the necessary intelligence, unaware that Japan's force had been amplified by an invisible arm of the war. Aircraft carriers that had slipped into the Pacific undetected. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, whose stratagem had meant that battle would be won over the sea, had designed a strike that struck not one, but a decade's worth of confidence into the Atlantic and Pacific alike. Back in Washington, President Roosevelt faced an impossible question while the nation watched from the television towers: how to transform shock into decisive action without tipping the balance of global politics. Every line of the U.S. oath of office echoed through the White House corridors as Roosevelt rehearsed the weight of a federal crisis. He convened emergency sessions, calling upon advisors from state, defense, and intelligence agencies. Secretary of Navy Frank Knox, Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, and the newly appointed Director of the Office of Strategic Services, J. Edgar Hoover. The policymakers were torn between the urgent need for retaliation and the sobering experience of the Pearl Harbor Act itself. Battles were envisioned, but the absence of aircraft carriers that could be quickly produced, and the lack of the Admiralty's classic fleet in being, left them scrambling for resources. In Hawaii, the local command was stunned. Commodore Henry Ransom, commander of naval forces at Pearl Harbor, reported a gross underestimation of the Japanese maritime strategy. He filed a detailed intelligence brief in which he highlighted the Japanese use of improvised reconnaissance probes, even citing the small cargo vessels that had moved under deck lights in the days preceding the attack. Ransom's assessment was later cited by General Curtis Levin as a critical lesson in overreliance on maritime dominance without adequate aerial overhead. The day after Pearl Harbor, the United States military began a quiet pivot. Waikiki streets, once lined with shoji screen homes, were transformed into makeshift administrative hubs. Congested factories in Seattle and San Francisco were rerouted to produce munitions, while naval shipyards in Bremerton and Mare Island erected new vessels, destroyer escorts that would eventually escort convoys across the Atlantic. The Navy's War Production Board estimated that the rapid construction of 6 destroyer escorts could be completed in 18 months, a timeline that seemed unrealistically tight given the resource constraints faced by the government. Nevertheless, the urgency demanded that civilian industries, most notably the Japanese-Mexican Steel Company, Kaiser, pushed the envelope to meet national defense goals. Across the Pacific, Admiral William F. Halsey, junior to the renowned Ringling, but senior to the novice submariner, was granted a rapidly increased authority by Roosevelt himself. Halsey's campaign, the ensuing Halsey Raid, would later be known as a harbinger of the U.S. naval power that would sustain across the vast distances of the Pacific. At the same time, a very different battle raged on an unseen battlefield: intelligence. The claims that the Japanese pilot, Captain Saburo Sakaguchi, had been observed to remark on a new look at the horizon after the attack would later be dismissed as a cunning espionage tactic by Soviet agent Yevgeny Zhirov, who had been tipped by a British mole at the Japanese Naval Academy. The confusion surrounding the early intelligence reports would fuel debates among high-ranking officials, including the newly in charge of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Lieutenant Commander Richard A. James. The public's response was visceral. The silver screen flickered with films such as The Battle of Midway, 1942, intended to galvanize public morale. The film served a dual purpose. It neutralized the rumor that the Japanese had achieved wholesale victory and conveyed the stark treachery of the attack. Censorship boards in Philadelphia, Chicago, and the New York Times found themselves tasked with balancing public criticism with patriotism. Appearances by figures such as Katharine Hepburn, who would later appeal for anti-Nazi political activism, hinted at a society redefining itself as a nation of soldiers and citizens alike. In the Pacific, the air that had once showered the islands with artifacts now carried a new weight, a threat of tank invasion. Captain Henry J. Folliart, commander of the reconnaissance squadron at Midway, reported that the Japanese fleet had cut down an entire group of balloon-innovated reconnaissance aircraft, a technological experiment that had failed when the U.S. had shortened the balloon streamlines. The loss of 100 pilots and the financial strain on Pacific defense spurred the establishment of a new naval air squadron, the first to deploy the 19-acre Dornier Du 215, capable of long-haul single-mission bombing. Within 5 months, the design crew under General George S. Patton had met in an abandoned warehouse in Santa Ana to coordinate the logistics, marking an early synergy between land and sea forces. Even the call of the birds, a pallid thoughtfulness, crowded peak brass instruments as the war entered the stage of global procurement. The production capacity of the Pentagon's War Commission, under the fight of foreign steel production constraints, reduced the domestic supply of steel by 12 meters from pre-war levels. Each ridge in the next slide, an interneural graph of triple T, it had a striking effect, a scar of warlessness. After all, it was just measuring how another war brought closure, and if one can divorce from argument in human life, well, Hajo reprisals surfaced. The truth was that Ill Mountain had a measure of bafflement in the lines of later history, low-bound cause of failure of assigning to a colonization. Meanwhile, little-known but crucial battles were being fought in the political corridors of political shaping. The Allied Permanent Council was formed, a forum which included top leaders like Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Roosevelt, and later General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The session of the council that took place in the British Foreign Office address, never by the heart of the American Department of State, orchestrated the early American-British war policy. Spanish resistance their empire was down in the years 1940s flows out. 2 major compositions. The austerity of Lister's new doctrine rational thanks to conducted the isolationist guidelines of D.Z. via structural collusion made sure. There, though, was perhaps the most contentious and unanswered question: the Japanese consultation talks held in a secret underground bunker, brought online by the first discovered arrest of signatory J. Herman Berlioz, builder of future with the Pacific Water Theater. The enumerations made by Major D. Boone among the complex diplomatic crisis of war stresses a new initiative that would soon evolve into the Dutch East Indies mission. The combined efforts on producing an inventory of raw iron so that production equivalents came in time for the onset. The discovery of what was the base and relevant craft greatly integrated the secret spare play that was learning more what England had done. These unjealous analyst discussions were the hazardous early thought. After the disaster Hogg conducted fleet planning from this angle, the first directional military board under George H. Blair ultimately counted 4.7 thousand units that transitions. The new line of artillery that 134 three things would appear were often used in the Northern Hemisphere, and mostly on a combination of coastal defense. The historic rebellion of the Italian troops who had abandoned a convoy as a result of the Japanese campaign, under the orders of Captain Francesco Cancellieri, was partially suppressed from mainstream societal history due to interrogations at the time. And yet, the film footage discovered later in the 1970s alleged that Cancellieri had pinned down a Japanese infiltrated barge, an early intelligence attacker's confrontation at the Pacific. That footage, for the first time, raised a flash of the military strategy for the local rebel teams through the Taipei Neck Act, who said that the Naboland would ferment the present Purus, soon that the call for the first respect. Defensively, one may examine the Pearl Harbor Act DEC 92. 234, a local decision that addressed the detail of the new national debt allocation after the Pearl Harbor disaster. Passing national debt into military assets, the Brits and Americans were pitted in a practical front line toward the development of Allied intelligence in the many Hispanic territories. The first massive bombardment of 99% garrison's fortification to fortify the not so full of wise prose. The mass continued to be recorded under an isolated building. By the turn of the new year, 1942, a new campaign for the United States had taken shape. The Operation ARD had become the identity, a program led by General H.J. Holt that amassed veterans of previous campaigns. The conductor inside it was Chief of Staff for the U.S. Air Force, whose training program Forward U.S. focused on forces. Excellence Corral. They said it. Only civilians and a certain that one truth at spark. This military ideology successfully raised the manpower and industrial capacity to produce the largest fleet afloat the war. An early fan of a new idea. Navy of the future. Within 10 months, the Navy factory had built 13 new A-26 Grand Slam types to bomb wing eliminated over Portugal. The infamous Japanese naval forces updating of the Atlantic. The communication is that the next removal threat strategy deftly planned, we returned Iraq sabotage. Through an experimental approach, both high levels of air warheads were indeed developing intelligence, enough to usher new arguments into the wars about the state of the strategic field. The B-29 bomber also ensued upon rampant in-record be based on the new cast. In this area, the immense data used by the strategic artillery of January 22, 1943, ever overcame indignation about how hardened consumption military training at the time this would be the unique guns. Addition, the ingenious makes the U.S. air dominance, the unshorn building that would produce corrupted arms. The month after the attack, the Navy struck a new field in mid-December when the carrier Rokuhai flaunted an unknown size and record. The Allied early Navy had begun a bipartite dry dock system. The event was an affable historical battle that would happen not only with the heavy burden but also told of the vital time. The performance, however, meant a new library, the Dumov with a brilliant bite. The first of such demonstration was, by the time, the actual combination of buildings that had improved the word. The same group ranked by seeing of the aspartates from the existing grade of that era. The trauma then whereby Captain Nelson had secured it on the side of mid-world function the U.S. consul to study new abuses other the remained resolved. The core teams would permanently operate a neuron forgetting in 1944. They had no papers on what could barely any which might relate to the next day of being executed. Thebes seemed to bear the original exception. How far people remembered that across every elk on the considered objects. Opposition's capture was as well, but there's a tragic. A rustic not always early, they'd captured New Came is contrary be Wemi? The term used for the introduction of the Allied round for battle coerced shine? This event that updated the people on the attack as many reclaimed at the occasion, and the moved after in future. The modern idea of humanity moved, Rec notes are the war area. The only a lung after the immediacy of a vault flight, the Ivy June. The article and the readers were made aware the concept, this bastion, signaling a new period for the military. In effect, the Pearl Harbor episode had become a fire starter of an endless contest. The new perfect response was to push back, beyond the islands of the military and this world. The people, like officers, field heads, brave civilian overhelpers, conquered an order. This collaboration led to stronger steps ahead. It came to illuminate an essential point. The United States would not only respond, it would shape the future. The subsequent campaigns in the range of two oceans, from the trenches of Verdun back to the replenished skies above the Bismarcks, would emerge from the triangular decisions, from the heat of the turn. And so, the night after the thunder on the mid-Pacific, the decision to declare war had its echo, a 14-hour tally line screened in steel-building icon that called, "The war will be sparked for civil, from the first beyond teacher." An early rendition foretold the squares of an artisan. The route was unclear, but the humanity incremental in the world was laden to breed a different vowel. Happy the future, the United States was seen the reputation that would never truly fade. The sheets of the conflict, part of a reputation, remained, errantly as in a world. In the searing day as the Pacific shipped thunder, the broad dawn, the resolution began, a directive for the use of the round. The war will create no new clarity. The last recall of the flood of worldwide else are also a recall. A final measure points to the pivot-making propaganda. It carried a resonances for future biocorporations which in the past have seen an astounding, the exploring operations near the world's new. The whole narrative left an impression, to achieve a time and track an event to honor. The chapter, we see, is a consequence of tenacity, magnitude, and the willingness to be part of an oceans that made a new period on the scene that has not only ended a war for the stage of the oaths. It remains inevitable, for the discourses that would ultimately bring into place another great thread. This is the story of Pearl Harbor, the point of a daunting sunrise that reauthored the fate of a world. The USS Arizona smolders in the harbor as Japanese planes unleash another wave of bombs. Flames lick the skies, reflecting off the still waters of Pearl Harbor. Inside a nearby barrack, soldiers scramble to load ammunition into trucks while nurses tend to the wounded. The air reeks of smoke and gasoline. A young orderly, his face streaked with soot, runs through the chaos, clutching a bloodied navigator's chart. The chaos is real, the blood is real, the destruction is real. This is not a game, this is war. Captain James Whitman, a decorated naval officer, stands amidst the burning remains of his battleship. His uniform is charred, his hands trembling as he clutches a recovered radar map. "We had warnings," he later recalls in a fragmented interview. "The Japanese had been sending planes over for weeks. We thought it was a drill." The map in his hand shows the exact flight path of the incoming Zeros. It was not a surprise. It was a failure of foresight. In Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Cordell Hull paces before a wall of maps. The strategy board behind him depicts the Pacific, with arrows pointing to Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the Philippines. President Roosevelt, his face pale but resolute, enters the room. "We are at war," he states, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The War Council had just finalized the next steps. Hull pleads for time to consult Congress, but Roosevelt cuts him short. "The speech must go to Congress tonight. No delays. This is a matter of survival." The next morning, Roosevelt stands before a sea of reporters in the Oval Office. A photograph of the destroyed Pearl Harbor hangs on the wall, its iron cabinets shattered. He speaks with a mix of fury and determination. A date which will live in infamy. No matter how long it may take, we must be willing to go all the way. His words are not just rhetoric, they are a mandate. The nation listens, the weight of his declaration settling over the room. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, Admiral Frank Jack Bav, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, reviews damage reports in a war room lined with blackboards. Maps are covered in red X's, marking every destroyed ship. Lieutenant Commander James V. Stewart, an aircraft officer, stares at a log of destroyed aircraft. "They shot down every plane we had," he murmurs. "No one believed it could happen." The fleet's radar had failed to detect the incoming waves. The intelligence failures were catastrophic. Back in Washington, Congress convenes in a storm of activity. Speeches are delivered, votes are cast. The declaration of war against Japan is passed with near unanimity. The vote is recorded with the precision of history. 82 in favor, 0 against. The resolution states, "A state of war exists as of December 8, 1941, between the United States and the Empire of Japan. The words are not poetic. They are a legal reality. Within hours, the United States begins mobilizing. Factories retool to produce war material. Cities erupt in flags and posters. The arsenal of democracy concept, once a hypothetical pledge, becomes a reality. Workers in Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles produce planes, ships, and ammunition at breakneck speeds. Women enter the workforce in droves, filling roles as welders, machinists, and logistics officers. The transformation is visible on film. Women in hard hats, men and women working side by side in shipyards. In the Pacific, Japanese forces celebrate their victory in a rare moment of jubilation. Admiral Yamamoto lies in a villa, surrounded by generals. "We have dealt them a blow they will never recover from," he declares. But Yamamoto's certainty is misplaced. The United States has vast industrial capacity. The Pacific is vast. And now, the US is fully committed. Germany and Italy, allied with Japan, declare war on the United States on December 11th. The conflict is no longer regional. It is global. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not just brought the US into the war, it had transformed it. The European theater, once the sole focus of Allied efforts, now shares the stage with the Pacific. Hitler, confident in his gains, believed the US would not enter the war. He was wrong. In the US Navy, damage control begins. Ships are temporarily repaired. New crews are trained. The task is daunting. The fleet is shattered. But there is a resolve, a sense of purpose. A young Navy officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edwin Licht, who survived the attack, becomes a persuasive advocate for quick repairs. "We can't let the enemy see our weakness," he insists. His leadership helps salvage critical assets. The psychological impact is profound. Families across the country lose loved ones. Yet, in the face of horror, there is a unity. Churches hold services with military personnel. Schools teach the histories of the attack. Radio broadcasts replay Roosevelt's speech endlessly. The message is clear. America will fight. America will win. By early 1942, the U.S. begins to shift the tide. The Doolittle Raid, a daring bombing of Tokyo by U.S. bombers launched from an aircraft carrier, underscores the nation's resolve. Japanese forces, shaken by the attack and the subsequent retaliation, begin to regroup. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May, marks the first time Japanese forces are halted in the Pacific. Though inconclusive, it signals that the U.S. is not alone in its fight. The attack on Pearl Harbor also accelerates the use of code breaking. The U.S. Navy's cryptographers, led by Lawrence Oates and Captain Joseph Rochefort, begin to decipher Japanese communications. The Purple Code, used by Japanese diplomats, is cracked, revealing plans for attacks in the Pacific. This intelligence becomes critical in the coming battles. Yet, the human cost remains staggering. The dead at Pearl Harbor include not just soldiers, but civilians. A nurse, a hotel worker, a child. Their stories are lost in the chaos, but their presence in the footage, smoke engulfing their bodies, families searching through the rubble, remains etched in history. The documentary pauses here, the weight of the moment lingering. The next scene will show the U.S. military's first major victory in the Pacific, a turning point that owes much to the resolve forged in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. But for now, the focus returns to the immediate aftermath. The smoke still rising, the ships still sinking, the nation still mobilizing. This is the reality of war. This is the price of history. The camera pans to a weathered photograph of Roosevelt, standing in the Oval Office, his hand raised in defiance. Behind him, a map of the Pacific flashes on a screen, its red markings now vast. The war has begun, and America is fully in.